Hi, my name is Daria, and in this video, I'll be taking you through Blackmagic Design's mini panel. We're going to begin with the primary controls at the bottom of the panel. These three trackballs correspond to the three tonal ranges in the primary's color wheels palette. That's your lift, your gamma, and your gain. The rings around the trackballs correspond to the master wheels. So using these, you can normalize your clips or establish contrast. So for example, I could use the lift master wheel or lift ring, rotate it to the left to lower the shadows or the bottom of the scope's parade. I can then use the gain to reduce the brightness to get rid of some of that clipping in the highlights and normalize the clip a little bit. And then use the gamma to brighten the overall image. What's great is that I don't have to look at my hand or my mouse to navigate over to the color wheels palette as I do this. I don't have to look at the master wheels as I navigate between them. My hands are already naturally situated on the trackballs, and I can very easily establish these ranges and even move them at the same time as I develop the contrast. So it gives me a little bit more flexibility and more fluidity as I color grade. Above all of the trackballs, I can see reset buttons. So all three of them have an all reset for both chrominance and luminance, but then on either side, you're able to reset either just the colors or just the luminance adjustments. So let's say after I establish my contrast, I decide that I want to warm up the image. I could use the trackballs themselves to push the control points towards a specific color. So in this case, I am moving my gamma towards an orangey tone, a nice little orange feel. And what's great is that, again, I don't have to look at my mouse or the control point in the color wheel in the palette as I do this. I can actually feel it out a little bit more organically and decide if I want to gravitate towards a more magenta pink, towards a more greeny yellowy type of warmth, and then also push the saturation as I go outwards. So it's a really nice intuitive way to work. If I decide that the color's gone too far and I'd like to, bring it back to its original setting, but I do like the gamma luminance that I've established, I could just click on the RGB reset above that wheel, and then we jump back to the original look. If I wanted to reset the luminance as well, I can click on level, and then that takes me to the original image with the gamma reset. To the right of the trackballs, I have my navigation keys. So I can navigate on various different levels. The bottom here, you can see that I can jump between clips on my timeline. I can also jump between frames within these clips, which is really good when performing tracking. It gives me a bit more accuracy. And then finally, I also have node navigation controls once I start creating more nodes in the node editor. So it's another one of those great things where I don't have to rely on my mouse and traveling from one end of the application to another. A lot of the work can be done by using keys directly underneath my fingers. Now, we've established where the lift, gamma, and gain wheels are, but you might be asking yourself, what about the offset? Well, this can be mapped to the existing trackballs by using some of the additional key controls above the reset keys. So you've got one in the center here called offset. When I toggle this switch on, the right-hand trackball turns into the offset. So now I can drag that towards a particular color. And just like with the other wheels, I can choose all to reset that parameter. The two wheels to the left become my temperature and my tint controls. So when I rotate my wheel to the left, I can cool the image down. When I drag it to the right, I can warm it up, and reset it in much the same way by pressing all. So let's take a look at a practical application of that. I'm going to go into clip number 2. And with my offset still enabled, I'm going to rotate the ring around offset to brighten the overall room. You can see the parades moving uniformly in the scopes, which tells me that it is indeed an offset adjustment. And then I can very quickly disable the offset toggle and then make individual adjustments to the luminance ranges, which means that I can protect my highlights by bringing down the gain. I can bring down the shadows to establish more of a contrast and still continue to maneuver the gamma. And in the end, I get a pretty well-distributed image, but it's still a little bit warm. So just as easily, I can click on my offset key and then rotate the leftmost wheel to cool down the image and essentially move it away from that yellow tone. So with just a couple of rotations, I've created this really nice neutral look. I can compare this image to the original by disabling the node that I currently have selected in the node editor. I have a disable key right up here on the right-hand side, which I can click to compare before and after. Also above the reset keys, I have the ability to toggle full screen view. I can click on Viewer to see the image full screen. I can also continue to hit the disable key to compare my grade before and after. And I can also use the playback controls in the bottom right corner of the panel to play back my clip. To get out of full screen mode, I'm going to click on the Viewer key one more time to get back into my interface. And I will jump ahead a couple of clips. And this time I can take a look at the log remapping as well. So just like the offset, it is also a toggle switch, and it allows me to jump into the log mode of the primaries palette. Log controls can be used for much more dedicated changes to your shadows and your highlights. So in an image like this, I could first of all disable log and just make a general adjustment to the brightness of the image by, for example, increasing the luminance in the gamma range to really brighten up the foreground elements. And then I can enable the log key to transform my 3 trackballs into shadow, midtone, and highlights. And then I can drag the shadow down by rotating the shadow ring and reveal some of the finer details in the shadows of this image. So shadow tonal ranges are more exact and not as broad as the lift, which means that I'm able to reveal this kind of information. If I disable this node, you can see that I've gone from having a very dark image with a lot of data hidden in the shadows to suddenly revealing a lot of that information with the help of log controls. When it comes to the adjustment controls that we use at the very top and bottom of the primaries palette, you will see these distributed across the top of the panel in the form of these knobs that you can rotate. So we have our contrast and pivot represented, our midtone detail, color boost, saturation, and others. Let me navigate to another clip, and here I can establish a contrast look by rotating slightly to the right, and then very easily being able to adjust the balance of that contrast by grabbing the pivot with my other hand and dragging in the opposite direction to get a good balance between how dark I want the image and how contrasted. Again, making adjustments to 2 parameters at once so that I don't have to move my mouse back and forth as I toggle just one at a time. I might then decide that I want to brighten up the overall image, so I can go for the Y gain control. So Y lift, Y gamma, and Y gain is like adjusting the luminance in the primaries wheels, but without affecting the saturation of the image. But I might change my mind and decide that I don't want to apply this parameter change, in which case I can reset any of my adjustment controls by simply clicking on the knob. So it is a button as well as a dial. If we return to the soft keys on the right-hand side, we have some additional controls. One thing we can do is grab stills without having to go into the viewer with our mouse. As soon as I press grab still, you would have seen that a thumbnail has appeared in our gallery. So one of the few things I would still use a mouse and keyboard for is then going into this thumbnail and giving it a custom label. But now I can navigate to a previous clip, and let's say I was trying to match the two. I could very easily press play still on my mini panel to compare the grades between the 2 clips in the viewer. Right now I have looping enabled in my viewer, but I can also disable that using the same soft key controls. So I'll toggle loop off, and now when I play back, once this clip reaches its end, it will then proceed on to the next clip in the timeline. And I can click play still to disable image wipe mode. In the top right corner of the soft keys, I have undo and redo functions, which allows me to very quickly take steps back in my grade. Or I also have a reset key, which allows me to completely reset the grade. Everything we've covered so far can be found in the DaVinci Resolve Micro Panel. I'd next like to take a look at the top half of the mini panel to show you where it really shines. So over here, we have a whole series of additional controls that give us access to virtually 90% of the remainder of the page. On the left-hand side, we have the ability to switch between different palettes of the color page. You can see that primary is currently enabled, but if I click motion for motion effects, the palette automatically updates, both in the color page to visually represent which palette is open, but also in the viewers in the middle of the palette, which show me which controls I have access to. So using these, I can also navigate to my curves controls, my power windows, my tracker, etc. So yes, you can even work with power windows and track using just the mini panel. When you're navigating between palettes, you'll find that you have some additional controls in the form of the soft key modes, which are the two arrows in the top corner here. So with primary selected, I can jump between my different color wheels, or in this case, these will be your color bars or your printer lights. When I'm in my curves, for example, I can also navigate between the different curve parameters. And then on top of that, a lot of the palettes also feature a tools section here, which allow you to go even deeper into the palette. So for example, in the curves, I'm able to gang or ungang channels and choose individual colors to work on. And these all update in the color page interface as I select them. Let me regang the channels for now and click back. I'll also find soft key controls at the bottom of the viewers that allow me to switch to different pages of certain palettes. So in the curves, I'm able to navigate to different HSL curves correctors. And finally, at the bottom of the viewers, we have more knob controls, which also act as buttons with which you can make adjustments and reset your changes. I'm going to move on to a new clip and perform a basic grade. So here I will use my standard custom curves to adjust the contrast on this clip. I am rotating a control point at about the 20% point line downwards to darken the shadows, and then creating another point at 60% to raise it upwards and brighten the image, thereby creating contrast. You'll see that there are 20% intervals for points all the way across the line. If I was to click these, I would generate points on my custom curve so you can see exactly how they're spaced, so they're all an even distance from each other. But then I can also undo to take it back to just the S curve I had a second ago. Now with the contrast set up, I might still want to address some of the color imbalanced. I can see some magenta in this image. So here I can navigate to the tools controls, ungang my channels, isolate just the green channel to try to get rid of some of that pink tint. And we know that pink is essentially magenta and the opposite of magenta is green. So I will go for the 60% line. And if I raise it just a touch, that redness will disappear from the image. And now we have something a little bit more neutral, still a bit warm, but I like to keep it that way. And I can press disable in the bottom half of the panel to check how that looks and see that I'm really happy with the result, which means I can move on. I'm going to jump to the very first clip in my timeline, and I would like to create a new node to work on. So we've already used this one for balancing, adding a bit of contrast. I would like to make a new serial in which I'm going to create some secondary changes. To create a new serial corrector node, I just have to go into the right side of the panel next to the viewers. These controls allow me to create new nodes, so serial nodes, but also mixer nodes like parallel and layer, as well as introducing nodes with windows already activated in them, as well as a few other controls like jumping between keyframes or selecting stills. In this case, it's enough for me to click serial, so that I have a new node to work on. And what I would like to do is, first of all, change the color of the door in this image. All right, so let's say we want it to be a different color. We still want to stick in the curves palette, but I will go back in my controls, and this time I will select hue versus hue, which will give me the control that allows me to select a color and adjust it into a different hue. In this case, we have a door that falls somewhere between cyan and blue. So I am going to drag one of these dials, the cyan, rotate it upwards until I change the color of that door. And I think that's a pretty good space for it to fall. You can kind of see where the control for it lies in the curves graph in the interface. I can also use the input hue control on the right-hand side to then change where this point falls horizontally. So I'm not just locked into these color parameters. And that way the door is a little bit cleaner. It's not just approximating. You can see that the point now falls very close to the histogram representation of that door in the curves graph. I might also decide to make the door a little bit less dramatic, less bright. So for that, I will switch to hue versus luminance and still go for the same color range, but this time I'm going to drag it down to darken it and make it a little bit more realistic to look at. Finally, I might want to also desaturate the color underneath the door. So you can see there's a bit of an orangey red tinge under it, and I'd rather keep it neutral. So that's what we have the luminance versus saturation tool for. This is a tool in which you can select a certain luminance range in the image, so in this case, the bright lit area under the door, and then affect its saturation. Here, I only have 4 range controls. I can start with the white point on the right-hand side, drag it downwards to try to desaturate some of that area. I can also go for the highlights, which is the next custom point. But I might find that because there's such a great deal of overlap with the remainder of the image, that the image overall starts to go a little bit desaturated. So what I can do is try to lock off the majority of the image, especially the midtones, using the shadows. I can even click on the shadows to lock off that point in its original position so that there is no change. And then use the input luminance, just like I did with the HSL curves, to kind of extend the area that's being protected. And as I push this outwards, more and more of the colors in the image start to come back. And it is truly just the highlights that get affected as much as they do. So that's a really good way of protecting ranges in your curves. It's just by clicking some of the dials that you want to lock in place, and then a point is created around which you can work. All right, I will now jump to the next clip, which will be number 3 in my timeline. And here my intention will be to work with my interview subject. I'm going to re-enable looping in my soft keys and play back this clip. And I mean, it is a gorgeous shot. The only problem is that our interviewee is wearing a wide brim hat, which makes it a little bit harder to see her face. So usually we like to light people up quite well when we're interviewing them. And in this case, she's got quite a long shadow cast over her face. So what I would like to do is just add a standard window, oval window around her face and brighten her up a little bit. I'm going to jump to the very beginning of this clip. There we go, first frame. And I'm going to create a new node with a circular window already attached. So that's in my controls on the right-hand side, node plus circle. And immediately we see a new node in the node editor, the circle in the viewer. You can see by the representation in the node 2 thumbnail that we're already making a selection in that region. So it's just about placing it in the right place in the viewer and then performing a track. I have all of the controls that I need underneath the viewers in the panel. So I can use pan and tilt to very quickly maneuver the circle over our subject. I can then use aspect ratio and size to get it to match pretty much the distribution of her face and her neck, and then use the softness control to blend it out a bit so it's less obvious that we're using secondary color grading to make an adjustment. So my selection is now made, and I can start performing the color grade immediately because I have all my primary controls right under my hands. But if I didn't want to see that window outline, a very quick way to achieve that is simply to switch to a different palette like the curves, and the outline disappears. So now I can use the gamma ring to brighten up her face a little bit. And you can see the shadows are starting to disappear right under her hat. If she's starting to look a little bit flat, then I can use my contrast controls to bring some more detail back into her eyes and her eyebrows, but then use the pivot to make sure that it kind of leans towards the lighter side of things, so we can still read her facial expressions and we're not just reintroducing more shadows. I could even add a little bit of mid-tone detail, which is right next to the contrast controls, and also use something like color boost in case, I find that the gamma took out, some of the color from her face. There we go. So before I even track, I just want to check what this grade has accomplished. I'll click on disable. All right, so that's before, that's after. I want to make sure that it's not too obvious. If it is starting to feel like a bit like a spotlight, then I can always go back to my gamma control and pull it back just a little bit. There we go, disable. right? And that's looking a little bit more natural. I can now navigate to my tracker palette using the soft keys on the left-hand side. And I have all of my analysis controls at the very top here. And I can see that I have a forward analysis available to me. I can click on that. And relatively quickly, it's run an analysis of the entire interview. And I can play this back in real time to see how well that follows, and I'm really happy with that result. So it's still following her face and her neck. It's still soft around the edges. Once again, I can click on the curves soft key so that I'm no longer seeing the outline. And that way, if there was still a bit of like a halo around her, I can always go back to the window palette and make further changes. And the great thing is that I don't have to run the track a second time. The tracking data is already there. So if I needed to change the shape or the size, that's all there was to it. I make it and I keep playing back, and the overall movement remains. Now let's take a closer look at the node editor. I'm going to jump into a brand new clip. And this clip has already been balanced. So if I disable the first node that's present, you can see that the image has been brightened up and there's been a bit of a color boost applied to the environment. I would like to make a few additional changes. First of all, I'm very distracted by this overcast or blown out sky, so I would like to introduce a bit of color back into it. I will start with a serial node, and knowing that I will want to create a look at this stage, I would rather also introduce a layer node so that I can work on the sky separately. So with that new node selected, I'm going to press on the layer soft key, and that will give me a layer mixer node with a layer node underneath that, number 3. So once again, I return to my keyboard just so I can name this node and keep track of what I'm doing in each one of these. I can also use my mouse to move these around and keep track of where I am. And now I can make my sky selection. I will press the qualifier soft key to open up my HSL qualifier controls. And you can see that hue and saturation are already represented in the viewers, but I can then use my arrow keys to navigate to the luminance control as well, which is what I will primarily need for a selection like this because it's just a white sky. There's not much of a color to target or saturation range. But what I do need to do is indicate that there's a certain luminance range that I would like to go after. It's a little bit hard to just go by eye, so it's really helpful to also see what that qualifier selection looks like. That's called highlight mode in the viewer, and you can see the highlight soft key on the right-hand side here, at the top of the panel. When I activate it, I can see the highlight icon has appeared above my viewer, but it's not made a difference because obviously I haven't made a selection yet. So I'm going to rotate the low luminance knob, and I'll see that range get narrower down in the qualifier palette. And then when I look up at the viewer, I will eventually start to see elements disappearing that no longer fit within that high range. So if I go high enough, there you go, you can see the shadows start to disappear first, then the midtones, then the highlights. But eventually the sky will remain because it is just that blown out. It's just that bright. So once I bring it up to this extent, I can start to clean up the selection further. So as I navigate further to the right, you can see I've got my matte finesse controls, which we always use at the very end to further clean up our selection. So at the very least, I'd like to perform a little bit of denoising to get a cleaner edge on this selection. And then I'm good to continue grading. I can turn off my highlight mode and use my standard primary grading tools to, for example, darken the sky. So in this case, I'm rotating the gain ring to the left to darken it, and then also add color to the sky. So I'm going to use the trackball itself to introduce a blue color, and right now it's kind of going for more marine blue. I'm going to drag it downwards to give it a warmer blue. There we go. And then I can continue to decide on the brightness of the sky with that ring. And that looks quite natural to me, so I'm very happy with it. I can click on disable to compare before and after, and you can see that that was a really quick adjustment, in order to perform essentially sky replacement. I can also navigate between my nodes if I wish to continue working on them. So again, we're not touching the mouse if we don't have to. I have previous node and next node available to the right of the trackballs. So I can click that a couple of times or as many times as I need to rotate between the available nodes, but eventually I'll land on the one that I want to address. In this case, I just want to work on the overall image, and after which I want the sky to overlay on top of that. I will give it a name though. I'll call this my detail node. And here I just want to boost some of the information that's already visible in the image. I will increase the midtone detail in order to sharpen a lot of the elements that we see in the foreground, the animals, the rhinos, the grass and the trees. I'll also rotate the gamma to brighten the foreground and also increase the color boost. Unlike saturation, color boost will increase the saturation intensity in colors that are naturally low in saturation. So that way, if I had something in the image that was already very high saturation, it's not going to be affected as dramatically as it would have been using a flat saturation adjustment. Okay, wonderful. So now when I disable the grade, you can see that the foreground has been boosted up, and now I have that really brilliant sky laid over the top. As well as the disable key, I have a bypass key with which I can bypass the entire pipeline, which means that this is my original video signal, and this is our end result. What about if I wanted to add a node at the end of this pipeline? For that, I could use the append soft key. That will add a new node right after the layer mixer. It has appeared a little bit off to the left because it hasn't got enough room. You can always fix this by reducing the size of your nodes if you had to. But in my case, I'm happy to go in and manually perform a little bit of housekeeping. But there you can see that's where the node has appeared at the very end. And here is where I might want to create my look. I'll accomplish this using my curves palette. Return to that. I'll go back into my custom curves, which is where we have, all of our different channel controls. I'm going to go into my tools and make sure that the channels are unganged, and specifically, I want to target the blue channel. I'm going to go for a cross-process look, and I would like to do sort of a reverse S-curve on the blue channel. It's going to give me like a really nice fairy tale type of look. So blue shadows, yellow highlights. And because we're applying it at the very end of the pipeline, it is affecting everything prior to that, including the sky. I can even increase the contrast to make this a little bit more dramatic, make it pop if I wanted to. There we go. When I disable this node, you can see that that's a pretty substantial color shift. I do very much like the yellow highlights. But then if I bypass the whole thing, then that's a lot more dramatic. Finally, something I need to touch upon is to do with a new addition to the color page in DaVinci Resolve 17, and that's the HDR palette. So even though there isn't a soft key directly related to it, I can navigate to the HDR palette by holding the user button in the bottom right corner of the soft keys on the left, and I will find HDR as an option in my viewers. So I hit the soft key right above that, and that will open up my HDR controls, and it will also launch the high dynamic range palette on the left-hand side of the color page. I have previous and next zone controls at the top of the viewer, with which I can bank my HDR wheels. And wherever I'm rested when I'm banking, I can then use the arrows in the soft keys on the left to navigate between the banked color wheels. So at the moment in the dark zones, I have my black, my dark, and then if I move one page across, I have my shadow and my global, just like I do in the palette on the color page. And then the three wheels at the bottom of the panel are mapped accordingly. So I can start to rotate the ring on the right trackball, and I will find that the shadow exposure starts to go down. Or I can move the trackball, and I will find that those shadows get affected first. And reset works in much the same way. Using the viewers, I can also switch to the zones graph. And that way I can see what the zone graph distribution is in the color page interface while still controlling all of my individual tonal ranges. So underneath here, I still have my zone pivot controls, my zone fall off, as well as things like exposure and saturation. If I was to make a custom zone, that will automatically map itself to my color panel interface. So let's say I was in my HDR palette and I had a very distinct look that I was going for, and I decided to call it midtone. That tonal range will now appear in my list of tonal zones, and it will also appear in the viewer as long as it's banked. So if I switch back to my wheels view, I can use previous and next zones to navigate to an area where I can see midtones, and I can always navigate to it using my arrow keys. So there's my midtone, and I can then decide to control the exposure and the saturation. With highlight enabled, I can determine where I want the zone to begin. So I can drag it all the way to the left here. And now I know exactly what I'm targeting in the image. I can also adjust the fall off range so that we have a more robust target on the shadows. And now I can turn up highlight mode. And I know that the midtone is my central wheel, so I can then make adjustments to it here. And maybe make the image a little bit more dramatic looking with that type of contrast. And that takes us to the end of this mini panel overview. As you can see, a lot of this work can be done with just a mouse and a keyboard, but working with the panel is so much faster and so much more efficient, especially as you start to take on larger projects. And you'll find that as you spend less time traveling across the page, a 3-day job can become a 1-day job. Thanks so much for watching.